The first joke landed before the briefing even started, which meant everyone in the Reddit room was already looking at her when the ops major tapped the patch on her shoulder with the end of his pen and said, "Relax, people, the Uber service is here." And the room rippled with low laughter because it was safe to laugh at the quiet woman in the transport jacket and not at the man with oak leaves on his chest. So she only tightened her jaw and stared at the glowing mission board while the misjudgment settled over her like another layer of flight gear. And no one in that crowded, fluorescent lit box knew what they were laughing at. The big screen at the front showed a stylized map of the valley, threat rings pulsing soft red around Sam's sights, a column of icons marking the general's convoy route, and in the top corner a digital clock counting down 90 minutes to step off. So while the major marked flight paths with a capped marker and a cocky strike lead sprawled in his chair with his boots half out of regulation on the table, the young pilots and ground crew leaned back and watched the little block letters next to each aircraft slot populate with call signs, smirks already forming as they waited to see where they would stick hairs. "Strike 1. You'll lead the escort," the major said, drawing a bold arc over the valley and circling a pair of sleek fighter icons, and the strike lead grinned and nodded because this was what he lived for, the part people would talk about later, while the woman sat second row, hands folded loosely around her knee board, expression unreadable beneath short dark hair pinned neatly back, because she had learned the hard way that the moment you showed offense they could push twice as hard. "Strike 2. You're the trailing element," the major continued. They made a show of squinting at the list as if something amused him, and finally he drew a smaller, less glamorous icon behind the convoy and tapped it with the pen. "An hour shuttle," he announced, glancing over his shoulder until the entire room followed his gaze. "Call sign taxi." The word appeared on the screen beside her aircraft ID in bright, mocking letters because the systems didn't know the tone people used when they read it out loud, and the strike lead let out a short laugh and said, "Good. Keep the bus driver out of the merge, sir. We'll take care of the real work up front," which pulled louder chuckle from half the room and a few muttered yes, sir-s from people who didn't want to be on the wrong side of that joke. She felt her neck heat under the collar as the major walked closer, tapped the small gray wing patch sewn to her jacket, the one with a tiny lightning bolt and a dull silver pin fixed just above it, and said, "See this, kids? That's the international symbol for I haul luggage," and the laughter turned open now, not even pretending to hide, because the squadron commander was in the back with his arms crossed and he wasn't stopping any of it, which meant this was sanctioned entertainment, and if she answered back she would not only lose but hand them a story to repeat verbatim for months. She rolled her shoulders once, not enough for it to count as a flinch, and kept her eyes on the mission board, where the red threat rings pulsed and the timer ticked down to 1 hour 29 minutes and 53 seconds, 1 hour 29 minutes and 52 seconds, because the clock didn't care who got mocked and who didn't, and she needed to know every line of that valley if she wanted everyone to come home alive. The ops major started outlining the route, his marker squeaking over the laminated map as he emphasized how Intel cleared this corridor and we're not here to improvise, which drew a smirk from the strike lead as he shot a sideways glance at her as if to say, "Hear that? Taxi." And someone in the back whispered, "Hope she doesn't get lost," which turned into a ripple of snickers that might have faded if anyone in authority had cut them short. But instead the squadron commander just shifted his weight and said, "You heard him. Stick to the plan." So the laughter settled in as law, and she felt the weight of every eye deciding what she was and what she wasn't without knowing a single fact. She could have said something then, could have reminded them who had flown what, could have let a name or a past mission slip and watched the room recalibrate. But every time she had seen a pilot defend their ego in a briefing, it had cost the mission 2 minutes and the unit weeks of quiet trust. So she unclenched her jaw, swallowed her pride like she'd been trained to do in harder rooms than this, and simply asked, "Confirm tanker window," in a steady voice, which made the ops major blink, because it was harder to indulge in a joke when the target refused to play. And he pointed to the top of the screen and said, "Tanker at H+60 and holding track echo. You won't need it. Taxi, you're just ferrying the VIP," which let the strike lead roll his eyes and say, "As long as she doesn't drink half the fuel getting there," drawing one more chorus of low laughs. The countdown clock glowed above their heads, numbers sliding away every second they spent laughing instead of listening. But the room preferred the comfort of its own narrative over the discomfort of recognizing they didn't know who they were talking to. So when the briefing ended and chairs scraped back and people surged for the door, the label had already hardened in their minds. She was the bus driver, the one you left at the back when things got hot. And the fact that she said nothing as they brushed past, trading jokes about Uber and baggage fees, felt to them like confirmation they were right, which meant the injustice walked with them right out onto the sun-blasted flight line. The desert heat hit like a wall when she stepped outside, waves of hot air rising off concrete and the smell of jet fuel mixing with dust, and the social pressure from the ready room followed her in the form of sideways glances and smirks from the ground crews because word traveled faster than sound on a base like this. So by the time she reached her aircraft, a hard-use gray jet configured for multi-role, but tagged in the system as transport today, the crew chief was already grinning as he jerked his thumb at the nose art where someone had painted a small cartoon taxicab months ago and said, "Don't miss my stop, okay?" Which got a laugh and the younger techs clustered around the ladder. She didn't answer because there was nothing to be gained by sparring with people who had already decided they knew her. So she just climbed the ladder, set her knee board on the rail, and started her pre-flight with a precision that had kept her alive in places none of these kids had heard of yet, tracing her gloved fingers along panel lines, fasteners, and ports, listening to the subtle differences in how the air hissed and how the metal felt under her touch. Which was how she noticed one access panel that wasn't latched flush, a tiny misalignment that could have become a problem at altitude. She leaned back down, called to the crew chief that she needed the panel opened and resecured, and he rolled his eyes and said, "She's picky, too," loud enough for others to hear. So one of the techs muttered something about transport princess under his breath, but when they cracked the panel open there was a loose connector bracket that could have rattled itself free under high G. And the crew chief's grin faltered as he called for a fix, which meant someone on the line. At least, so there was more under that quiet surface, even if he didn't say it out loud. While they worked, she rechecked her fuel numbers and caught a minor load discrepancy. Forward tanks not balanced to plan, so she had them corrected as well, because a slightly nose-heavy jet flew differently in the thin, hot air over the valley, and she needed every control surface to do exactly what she asked if the day went sideways. The tower's voice crackled over external speakers in the background, counting down minutes to convoy liftoff, and an intel officer moving between aircraft called up, "Enemy fighter patrol rotates through that sector in 40. Copy," which meant that every minute of delay on the ground would steal a minute from their safety margin in the air. Yet the pilots around her still found time to stroll, joke, and slap each other on the shoulders while she moved with deliberate efficiency because she knew the clock did not care about their swagger. Another pilot walked past, paused to tap the yellow taxi painted under her canopy rail with 2 fingers, and said, "You sure you can handle more than luggage today?" in a tone that was more performance than question. And the crew chief smirked again because it was easier to align with the visible hierarchy than to question it. So she just looked through the cockpit glass at the threat rings on her knee board map, tracing their edges with her pen, adjusting waypoints by habit to account for terrain masking, radio dead zones, and likely mobile launcher hide sites. In the ops center, a watch officer updated a digital bar to reflect convoy plus escort plus taxi launching T-12, and on a monitor a live feed from the flight line showed her aircraft and her jacket and the patch on her shoulder. And a young controller zoomed in for a second and frowned because the small gray wing emblem and silver pin didn't look like any standard transport insignia he recognized. Yet when he asked an intel major beside him, the man glanced up, barely looked, and said, "Some airlift thing. Don't worry about it," which meant the misread symbol stayed misread, even as the camera caught the way her hand brushed it once, almost unconsciously, before she pulled on her helmet. She strapped in, ran her checklist, listened as the strike lead bantered on the radio about making it home in time for the mess hall's good coffee, and when ground gave them taxi clearance he called, "Convoy flight, wheels rolling, let's go, taxi, try not to hit any curbs," drawing chuckles over the net because they carried the ready room's tone all the way into the cockpit, and she simply responded, "Taxi copies," in that same even, controlled voice, lining up behind the others because restraint was the only way to keep the air clear until it absolutely had to burn. As they rumbled toward the runway, The tower called out that the general's ground convoy was approaching the departure point and that enemy fighter patrols would cross the outer ring in 38 minutes, which meant the window for a clean transit was already narrowing. But no one treated it like the warning it was, because the comfort of intel cleared this corridor still held. They took the runway in sequence, afterburners lighting in long white plumes in front of her, and when her turn came she eased the throttle forward, feeling the jet surge as the desert blurred beneath. And as the wheels left the ground, she took one last look down at the base, at the hangars and the little knot of ground crew watching the flight climb out, some of them still laughing at something one of the pilots had said. And she wondered, briefly, what they would say later if they knew exactly what that patch meant. Then pushed the thought away because the valley was waiting and the clock was ticking and she had no room left in her mind for anything that did not directly help to keep a very important, very mortal man alive. The convoy snaked below them as a line of tan vehicles kicking up pale dust across the desert floor, boxed in by armored trucks and flanked by gun trucks whose gunners craned their necks to stare up at the specks of their own air cover against a washed-out blue sky. And in the air, the initial phase felt almost routine, which soothed the strike lead's ego and lulled the operations center into treating this like one more dull escort when nothing went wrong and everyone went home with their narratives intact. So when the first hints of wrongness crept in, they were easy for the people in charge to explain away. The woman in the third jet, taxi to their ears, something else on paper, saw it first, not because she was gifted with magic senses, but because she had seen too many ambushes from too many angles to ever trust cleared as anything but the opening argument. And the return on her radar was too sharp, too deliberate, a spike that didn't match the known patrol patterns or the civilian traffic lanes they'd been briefed on. So she keyed the radio and said, "Lead, taxi," painting intermittent spikes. Bearing 070 at high altitude, possible fighters outside plotted track, keeping her tone neutral because panic served no one. "Ghosts," the strike lead replied almost before she finished, sounding relaxed enough that some of the younger pilots in his flight smiled to themselves, because they liked a leader who didn't spook, and he added, "Intel said we're clean. Taxi. Maybe stick to counting trucks." "Yeah." Which drew a snort of laughter from someone on the net who only keyed their MIC long enough to let the chuckle bleed through. And that mockery carried across the ops center speakers as well, where watch officers stood with coffee cups and nodded as if that settled it. She checked her instruments again, verifying the return, and saw another anomaly, a faint ground-based radar sweep bouncing off the valley walls at an angle that didn't line up with the fixed sights they'd been warned about. So she said, "Ops, taxi, additional ground sweeps east of plotted SAMs, recommending minor route deviation 5 miles west to avoid potential mobile launches," which came out measured and precise because if she let her voice rise at all, they would seize on the emotion instead of the data. The mission commander in ops frowned at his own sanitized feed, saw nothing that contradicted Intel's earlier assurance, and replied, "Negative, taxi, maintain assigned corridor. We don't redesign the fight from the back of the bus." A phrase that drew a low murmur of amusement around him because it fit the story they'd built about her, and because they didn't yet see the cost of their desire to be right. She could have pushed harder, broke in tone, demanded they reconsider, but she had learned that forcing a fight over the net with a man whose rank and pride were both on the line was the quickest way to be muted. So she kept flying, checking and rechecking, watching the clock tick down toward the moment when enemy patrol and convoy lane would intersect, and trusted that if she couldn't change the decision yet, she could at least be ready when its consequences arrived. To the men on the ground, the first sign of the trap was a bloom of dust on a distant ridge, then the dull flash of something metal turned toward them, and the convoy commander shouted for his drivers to tighten formation just as a shrill warning in the jet screamed missile launch. So in the air, the strike lead swore and broke formation, the trailing fighters rolling and dumping flares in bright cascades which streaked orange against the sky as white smoke trails rose to meet them. "Contact! Contact! SAM launch, East Ridge." A wingman called, his voice high. "And taxi, stay on the edge. This isn't your lane." Another pilot snapped when she banked instinctively toward the threat, reducing her in a single sentence back to the joke even as weapons arced toward them. And in the ops center, people straightened, coffee forgotten, as radios exploded into overlapping calls. She did not argue because arguing took time and control. So instead she let the fighter element rush past, watched the missile trails with the trained eye of someone who'd flown into their teeth before, and rolled her jet at precisely the right moment, dropping countermeasures and using the valley wall as a shield to break two locks that had shifted onto her when she came too close, the A-craft shuddering as it bit into the hot low air just above the rock. "Taxi, pull back. Keep the package safe," the mission commander barked over the net, convinced that keeping her further from the fight would somehow protect the general whose aircraft flew ahead, high and proud, with its identifying flags and markings making it a perfect target. So she flattened her roll, settled slightly back, and used her radar and eyes to track both the fighters and the lumbering transport that carried the man every command decision orbited around. Because if she disobeyed, now she would be off the net before she had a chance to help later. The enemy fighters, unseen until then, swooped in from altitude, dark shapes cutting into the sun, and the strike lead yelled something too garbled to pause as he broke to engage, guns flashing and contrails twisting as the first dogfight erupted above the valley, which meant the escort was suddenly focused upward while mobile launchers on hidden slopes pumped more missiles toward the convoy from below. She saw the transport's contrail kink when one of those missiles detonated close, so its engines coughed smoke and its nose dropped, and the pilot's strained voice cracked over the net. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Royal, taking fire, losing power, attempting emergency descent," while ground units shouted conflicting reports about enemy vehicles breaking over ridges ahead and behind. "Taxi, hold your lane," came again from command, even as she lowered her nose and trailed the wobbling transport from just far enough back that she could see both it and the flickers of hostile armor racing to cut off its landing options, and she knew with painful certainty that their insistence on keeping her out of the merge was about to cost them dearly because every second she stayed back was another second the enemy had to tighten the noose. The transport slammed down into a makeshift strip of flat desert between two low ridges, bounced, skidded, and came to rest in a plume of dust and smoke. And almost before it stopped moving, dark trucks and armored cars began pouring out from behind rocks like ants finding dropped sugar, converging on the crippled bird because they knew exactly who sat inside. Convoy under attack, Royal down, ground elements engaging, came desperate calls from below, and she saw traces stitch across the sand, heard the ragged breath of the ground commander as he yelled for air support. But the fighters were still tangled with enemy jets overhead, and command was yelling at everyone to sort, prioritize, hold formation, and somehow obey rules that had been written for a fight less ugly than this. So she hung back at an officially safe distance and watched through her canopy as the ring of enemy vehicles closed around the downed transport, because she had been ordered not to do the one thing she was built to do. In the ops center, icons changed from green to red on screens as assets took damage or were lost, voices grew sharper, and as the situation deteriorated, whispers began at the back. "Where is Taxi? Why is she not in the fight?" Which fed into a narrative that she, the supposed bus driver, was hanging at the edge while the real pilots risked their lives, even though every restriction had been imposed from that very room. She saw the last friendly vehicle near the transport get overrun in a storm of traces, saw smoke grenades pop around the base of the aircraft as some of the general security detail tried to create cover and were forced back, and then the radio calls from the downed plane cut off abruptly, replaced by a single taste report from a drone orbiting high above. "Be advised, hostile forces have surrounded the target. HVT appears to be in enemy custody," and the words landed like a physical blow-in. Both the cockpit and the ops center because they were the direct consequence of all the earlier choices everyone had made. Her own jet, remarkably untouched apart from minor systems warnings, leveled out above the valley because she had flown smart when the missiles came. But every other friendly aircraft in that immediate slice of sky was either climbing away damaged or dropping out of the fight, and as the dust settled around the downed transport, she realized she was the only fully capable A-frame left in the area, marked on board logs as transport, stained in the minds of half the base as the pilot who stayed back, and yet positioned exactly where she would need to be if she ignored everything they had said and decided, on her own, to tame this around before the clock ran out. The radio net shifted tone in the minutes after the general was taken because the illusion that this was just another controlled mission died with the last clear, friendly transmission from the ground. And now every voice carried a thin edge of fear that translated into tighter language and harsher orders, which meant the woman in the third jet felt the squeeze of institutional pressure even before the Air Wing commander's voice came on the secure channel. "All A assets. This is Falcon Actual," he said, calm but strained. "We have confirmation that the high-value target has been captured. We are initiating Contingency Protocol Sierra. All aircraft not in immediate engagement are to return to base for refuel and retasking. Repeat, return to base. No unauthorized action near the HVT location." The directive slid through her headset, cold and final, because once a commander invoked a named protocol and called it twice, arguing was no longer a tactical disagreement. It was insubordination, and the people in the ops center who had watched her on screens now had official cover to say later she was ordered back and left the fight, which would lock the story into her record forever if she obeyed as written. "Falcon, this is Strike 1. Engage defensive. Still taking fire." The strike lead grunted between maneuvers, and "Copy. Strike, execute egress as able. Your priority is survival now," came the reply, which sounded noble on the surface but also confirmed that command was pulling everyone away from the downed general because they feared losing more assets in the same trap. Her fuel gauge ticked downward, bright numerals reminding her that each second at combat power burned her options away, and a separate voice from tanker control cut in. "Taxi, your refuel slot at Track Echo is at H+60. You will not have a second window due to threat realignment. Advise if divert required." Which meant she not only faced the moral weight of abandoning the general, but also the physical reality that if she did anything other than turn toward the tanker on schedule, she might not have enough fuel to make it home. Below, dust plumes showed enemy vehicles shifting, forming a column that began to push away from the crash. Sight toward a narrow cut between two ridgelines, and she knew, because she had read their tactics reports and flown over that terrain in simulations and real missions alike, that once they got the general through that pass and into the mountain complex beyond, any attempt to retrieve him would involve months of planning, dozens of lives, and possibly a failed war. "Taxi, acknowledge RTB." The mission commander snapped over the net when she didn't immediately comply, his tone turning sharp, and the strike lead, now climbing away, added, "You heard the man. Taxi, head home. This is above your pay grade," which drew a bitter comment from someone else in ops about the bus driver punching out early. And although she couldn't hear that remark, she felt its weight in the sudden, wrong assumptions holding her in place. She banked her jet slowly, turning toward the direction of the tanker as ordered, because she needed to know how that choice felt in her body before she could decide if she would live with it for the rest of her life. And as she rolled out, she saw, through a thinning haze of smoke, the shape of the convoy carrying the general already angling toward the pass, small and fast against the sand, and she calculated in her head the distance, her speed, and the rate of closure. And the math told her something the men issuing orders were refusing to say out loud. If anyone were to act, they would have to do it in the next few minutes or not at all. In the ops center, a young controller with sharp eyes and not enough rank to be listened to zoomed in on a pause frame of her cockpit camera feed, watching her gloved hand hover over the panel where her transponder control sat, and his gaze drifted again to the patch and silver pin visible on the edge of the shot, feeling that same prickle of wrongness he'd felt before. So he nudged the intel major beside him and asked, "Sir, are we sure that's a standard transport badge?" And the major, buried in updating the situational report, shrugged, said, "It's some airlift or ferry thing. Kid, log the HVT movement. That's the real story," and turned away, which meant the one person who sensed that they were misreading the symbol had his concern dismissed because it didn't fit the immediate narrative. On the other side of the desert, in a makeshift holding area near the crashed transport, the captured general sat with his hands bound, blood crusted at the edge of his hairline, listening to distant engine noise as his captors hustled him toward an armored vehicle. And when he heard the distinct pitch of a jet engine rolling away rather than toward them, he twisted enough to catch a glimpse of a gray shape against the sky, its profile and nose markings familiar in a way that punched through pain and disorientation, because he had seen that same combination before on an aircraft that had dropped through weather and fire to pull him and his men out of a death trap years ago. He squinted against the sun, saw the faint outline of a small emblem near the cockpit, and a name surfaced in his memory, matched to a calm female voice that had once said, "Royal, this is Guardian 2. We are on final for your extraction." And against his will his breath caught because the idea that the pilot who had saved him then might be the same one now flying away under orders cut deeper than any wound. So he murmured her call sign under his breath. More prayer than accusation. And the guard closest to him barked at him to keep moving, unaware that a single recognition had just connected the past and present in a way that would not let the day end quietly. In the air, the tanker controller's voice came back, this time sharper. "Taxi, you are drifting off optimal intercept. Adjust heading 20 degrees north or you will miss your window." And the mission commander echoed, "Taxi, acknowledge RTB now." That's an order, which pressed down from the institution like a physical hand on her head because if she disobeyed, she knew every camera and recording device would make sure there was no rewriting the moment later. She stared at the heading tape, at the fuel numbers, at the shrinking distance to the pass where the enemy convoy would vanish. And in that space between one breath and the next she realized that obedience here would be the choice that truly wrote cowardice into her permanent record. Not because she feared death, but because she would have traded someone else's life for the comfort of staying inside the lines. She keyed her MIC and said, "Falcon Actual, taxi copies recall," in a voice that sounded calm even to her own ears, because she had to say it to buy one last sliver of deniability in time. And the mission commander exhaled audibly over the net, relieved that at least this pilot would not be a problem, which relaxed tension in the op center just enough that a few people began already drafting after-action lines in their heads about assets returning to base for regroup, and that shift in posture created exactly the narrow window she needed. She reached out with one hand, flicked her transponder to standby so her track would vanish from friendly screens except as a faint primary return hugging the ground, then thumbed the switches that jettisoned her external tanks, feeling the jet shudder as thousands of pounds of metal and fuel dropped away toward uninhabited desert, and the machine leapt forward more eagerly as drag decreased, giving her back the agility she would need to survive what she was about to do. "Taxi, we just lost your IFF. Say again your status," someone in ops said, startled, while a radar operator called out that they still had a faint skin paint dropping altitude fast, and she did not respond because any word now would invite someone to try and stop her more concretely. So instead she pushed the nose down, dove for the canyon floor, and let the terrain swallow her while enemy radar swept blindly above, choosing in that moment to trade her career, and maybe her life, for the chance that the man bound in the back of that enemy vehicle would not spend his final hours on a propaganda feed. As she skimmed just above the desert floor, her jet kicking dust and sand into swirling ghosts behind her, alarms complained about altitude and clearance, and somewhere back at base the Air Wing commander stormed into the op center, snapping, "Where's Taxi? And why am I hearing that the HVT just crossed into enemy custody with no air on top?" Because the chain of events they had set in motion had finally forced the highest authority into the room, and whether they liked it or not, the next choices would have to go through him while a lone jet, officially labeled a transport and unofficially treated like a joke, knifed back toward the heart of the valley with every bridge behind her on fire. The last stretch to the pass became a tight braid of physics, training, and desperation because she had thrown away her safety margins along with her external tanks, which meant every maneuver now had to serve at least two purposes: survival in the moment and alignment for the next move that would either free or doom the general. So as she wove through the canyon at treetop height, she watched not only the ridgelines but also the geometry of likely ambush points, thinking the way the enemy planner must have thought when he set this trap. A low ridge on the left gave way to a wider basin where a small outcropping jutted like a tooth. And in her earlier study of the map, she had noted it as a perfect place to park a mobile launcher. So she swung right sooner than most pilots would have, hugging the opposite wall and using its contour to mask her approach until she saw the dark shape of a vehicle and the faint glint of a missile rail swiveling toward the sky, confirming that her mental overlay of the terrain had been right all along. She popped up just enough to let the launcher crew see her and panic, released flares and a short burst of chaff to clutter their radar, and yanked the jet back down before they could get a clean shot, which forced them to fire in haste at a ghost track and wasted one of their precious missiles on pure noise, buying her a sliver more space higher up the valley. On the guard frequency, an open channel anyone could use in extremis. She called any friendly ground elements near grid 91/37. This is taxi on low approach. Be advised hostage convoy moving toward the eastern pass. Multiple mobile launches active. Stand by for distraction. And although Doctrine said not to broadcast too much on that channel, Doctrine had also said not to be here at all. So she let necessity write its own rules. A voice crackled back, accented and tense. Taxi! This is Lantern Team. We are in low ground near that pass. Pinned by armor. Cannot close on the convoy. And she recognized the call sign from the briefing slide she'd memorized in silence. The one line most people had barely glanced at. Small Allied Special Operations Detachment and Overwatch, codename Lantern, which was why she'd planted that detail in her mind hours ago. Now the existence of that team meant she wasn't truly alone. She just had to give them the window they could not create themselves. Lantern, I'll draw eyes up, she said, voice steady. Watch for smoke at the bend. Move when they are blind. And as she spoke, she could hear her fuel warning shift tone, ticking closer to the line where she would have to choose between making it out or riding the jet into the ground rather than risk capture. But she pushed the thought aside because it didn't serve the immediate move. Back at base, the Air Wing commander stared at a blotchy radar screen where her IFF had vanished and only a low-level return flickered on the edge of coverage, and he snapped, "Get me that jet's raw feed. Now." So Tech scrambled to pull up her cockpit video and sensor data buffer, which fed into a big screen in the ops center seconds behind reality, showing her weaving through canyons at altitudes most pilots used only in training scenarios they cheated on, and the murmurs that rose from the gathered staff were less mocking and more unsettled now. Because this did not look like the timid behavior of someone out of a depth, it looked like a specialist doing exactly what she'd been built to do. She killed her transponder, the radar chief reported, but we still have her as a primary, hugging the ground. Sir, she's heading straight for the HVT convoy, and the mission commander blanched as he realized her apparent compliance had been a feint, so he started to sputter about charges and disciplinary boards, but the Air Wing commander cut him off with a raised hand because whatever else she was, the pilot on the screen was now their only asset between that convoy and the mountain. We are not going to lose a theater commander on live feed because we were afraid of paperwork, the general growled, which meant that the same institution that had tried to yank her back a few minutes earlier was now forced by circumstances to watch and, increasingly, to protect the space she had carved. In the desert, the enemy convoy reached the point where the valley narrowed to a choke, and as the armored vehicles slowed to negotiate the tight turn, she popped up from behind the last ridge like a thrown knife, rolling her jet nearly onto its side to pass so low that her wingtip vortices kicked dust into the open hatches of the rearmost truck, which caused the gunners to flinch and look up, exactly as she'd intended. She did not fire directly into the convoy because she had no clean shot at the general and because one stray round could kill the man she was there to save. So instead she lined up on the two lead vehicles whose armor and guns created the corridor of death, squeezed the trigger in a short, savage burst, and walked her rounds in a line that chewed through the road in front of them and along their side armor, forcing them to lurch, swerve, and block the narrow path so that the entire column crumpled into itself in a tangle of steel and confusion. Smoke billowed, drivers shouted, men dove for cover, and every weapon that could still traverse snapped upward toward the sky, pouring tracer fire and missiles into the space where her jet had been a heartbeat before, because she had violated their script and made herself the brightest target in the valley, which was the only way Lantern Team would ever get close. Her radar screamed locks, her audio filled with overlapping missile warnings, and she used every trick she had learned in a career she'd never been allowed to talk about in those ready rooms, dragging missiles wide by cutting into terrain at the last possible second, dumping flays in precise patterns, timing her power changes so that seekers chased ghosts of heat while she slipped sideways into the cool, turbulent air hugging the stone. Lantern, move now, she said through clenched teeth as G-forces pressed her into the seat, and out of the corner of her eyes she saw small shapes, 2 pickup trucks and a cluster of men on foot, surge from a dry wadi where they had been trapped, racing toward the disoriented convoy under cover of smoke and the enemy's frantic skyward fire. In the ops center, her cockpit footage showed the angle of her bank, the shimmer of traces streaking past her canopy, and the calm, focus way her hands moved on the stick and throttle, and the Air Wing commander found himself stepping closer to the screen, eyes narrowed, because this level of cool under that level of threat did not belong to someone who had only ever ferried cargo. "Who signed this pilot onto my base as a transport?" he asked quietly. And the mission commander, suddenly less certain, muttered something about personnel reassignment and classification, which only sharpened the general's suspicion that he had been handed a story with key pages missing. On the ground, Lantern's operators reached the rear of the clogged and half-wrecked column just as some of the enemy realized what was happening, and firefights broke out between vehicles, but every time a gun swung down to engage the man, her jet skimmed past again, ripping a burst of rounds across the dead or detonating a missile a few meters away, which forced those gunners back into cover and kept their heads turned upward instead of toward the hostage they thought they'd secured. "We have eyes on HVT," Lantern's leader gasped over guard, breathing hard. "We are breaching vehicle now." And she made one more pass, almost scraping paint off the canyon wall, to force a rooftop gunner to duck as the Allied soldiers blew the door on the armored truck and dragged the bound general out in a spray of dust and smoke, hauling him toward the relative cover of the rocks even as rounds snapped past their legs and ricocheted off the stone. Her fuel alarm changed tone again, a long, insistent note that said they were almost out of road in the sky, and she had to choose between one last pass to cover their extraction or an immediate break toward open space that might give her enough altitude and glide room to reach friendly territory. So she checked the angle of the sun, the distance to the base, the density of fire below, and decided that dying with an empty tank would be an acceptable price as long as the man whose life carried critical knowledge and the future of thousands made it into a helicopter instead of a cell. Last pass, she told herself as she flipped the jet into a descending roll that brought her across the mouth of the canyon at a diagonal, gun spitting in a precise pattern that punished any muzzle flash she saw without touching the cluster of shapes hugging the wall. And Lantern's leader yelled, "HVT CQ, moving to exfil point," even as a stray round cracked across the general's shoulder, cutting his uniform but not his flesh, which meant their margin had been shaved as close as physics allowed. At base, the Air Wing commander snapped, "Authorize emergency extraction now," and staff that had argued for caution 10 minutes earlier scrambled to vector a helicopter pair with escort into the outer zone, because the sight of the general stumbling through dust on the cockpit feed had made abstract risk violently real, and no one wanted to be the name on the line that said we waited too long. She pulled up at the canyon lip, engines whining protest as she demanded more thrust than the remaining fuel wanted to give, and angled toward open desert and the faint glint of rotor blades racing in, trusting that the small blot of heat and motion that was the exfil team would finish their run without her in the next seconds because she had done everything she could at this altitude. As she climbed, her jet stuttering on the edge of flameite, her recorder captured the image of men hustling a stumbling figure into the shadow of a rock where rotors would soon beat the air to shreds, and then the canyon dropped behind her and the desert opened up, blank and unforgiving, and she turned toward home with fuel numbers hovering in the red because the same audacity that had brought her here had eaten every reserve she had. The helicopter crews flew low and hard, blades carving grooves into the air as they dove into the canyon she had just vacated, guided by Lantern's frantic directions, and a drone caught the moment they burst over the rock and flared into the extraction point she'd drawn enemy fire away from, skids barely touching stone as the general was shoved into the cabin alongside his rescuers, who piled in and signaled go. Go while rounds peppered the canyon walls and one rotor blade took a nick that would cost a maintenance team a long night and a drink. The halos clawed back into the sky, slipping under the edge of the enemy's radar net because earlier disruptions had forced the mobile launchers to reposition and recalibrate, buying them seconds they would not have had otherwise, and as they shot out of the valley's mouth, the drone's video, her cockpit feed, and the helicopter's own cameras all stitched together into a single mosaic of what had just happened, projected in near real time on the big screen in the ops center where every person who had laughed at Taxi now stood silent, watching the story they had authored with their assumptions be rewritten by the one they had underestimated. Her jet crossed the desert like a wounded animal, one engine flickering as the other strained, and tanker control came back one last time, voice ragged with disbelief. "Taxi, you're below planned intercept. but we can drop to meet you if you can hold altitude. And she answered, finally, negative time to tanker, declaring emergency, lining up for dead stick if engines fail. Just keep the runway clear. Because the same laws of fuel and distance that had forced her to choose earlier still applied, and she would not compound the cost by pretending otherwise. The Air Wing commander heard that transmission, saw the flicker in her engine readings, and barked orders that cleared the runway, diverted inbound traffic, and lined crash teams along the strip, which meant that when she finally dropped the gear and let her half-starved jet glide toward concrete, the entire base that had once watched her as a joke now watched her as the linchpin of a story they could not yet fully understand but could no longer deny. The landing was more controlled fall than textbook approach because one of the engines coughed its last half a mile out and the remaining one wheezed at idle thrust, which left her coaxing the jet down on momentum and judgment alone, riding the edge between stall and overshoot while fire trucks and ambulances crouched along the runway margins like nervous animals ready to pounce. And when her wheels finally slammed into concrete and the tires shrieked, she let the A-frame shudder itself toward a halt with the help of every brake and chute and aerodynamic surface still functioning, leaving a ragged skid mark that would stain the runway long after the dust of this day settled. The jet came to rest with its nose slightly off centerline, smoke trickling from one engine, and crash crews surged forward, only to hesitate when she popped the canopy and waved them back, insisting on climbing down under her own power because she needed this moment to belong to her choices, not to anyone's rescue. Her knees wobbled when her boots hit the tarmac, muscles humming from G-forces and adrenaline, but she straightened, unlatched her helmet, and held it at her side as she walked toward the waiting vehicles, and if her hands shook slightly, only the closest crew chief could see, and he, who had once called her picky and laughed that morning, said nothing now because the cockpit footage had already replayed on base monitors as she made her emergency approach, and he knew better than to treat what he'd seen as anything other than what it was. MPs flanked her as she approached the waiting staff car, not because she was under arrest yet, but because someone had to accompany the pilot who had just violated direct orders, and the presence of their uniforms reminded everyone that there would be consequences beyond the emotional and tactical shocks of the last hour. So the whispers that trailed her toward the operations building were a mix of awe and speculation. Would they court-martial her, or would the fact that the general was alive change the math? Inside the hangar converted into an impromptu debrief theater, a crowd had already formed, pulled in by the gravity of a theater commander's capture and the promise of answers in the footage. Pilots in flight suits stained with sweat and smoke stood beside clocks still in rolled-up sleeves, and at the front, a giant screen flickered between live feeds and replayed clips of her canyon runs, each angle revealing new slivers of risk that made people inhale sharply or murmur obscenities under their breath. The Air Wing commander stood near the front, hands on hips, jaw set in a line that suggested he was still deciding exactly how angry or impressed he was going to allow himself to appear, and beside him the mission commander clutched a tablet full of logs that, only an hour earlier, he'd expected to use as evidence against a timid pilot who'd hung back. Now the data told a different story, and he wasn't sure yet how to reconcile his earlier dismissiveness with the tangible footage of what she'd done. When she stepped into the hangar, the hum of conversation dipped because the people inside knew enough to recognize the central figure when they saw her, and many of them still carried the sound of their own voices joking about taxi in their heads, which made it hard to meet her eyes. So some looked at her boots instead, or at the patch on her jacket, which suddenly seemed less funny and more like a problem they hadn't finished solving. Before anyone could start the formal debrief, though, the far doors banged open and a stretcher team wheeled someone in flanked by medics and special operations soldiers, and even before people saw the stars on his collar, they knew who it was, because the entire base had been living in the shadow of his capture since the moment that drone report came through. The general sat up on the stretcher against medical advice, tore the oxygen mask from his face, and insisted on climbing down on his own, waving away a medic's protest as he limped across the hangar floor toward the small cluster of command staff at the front, and the room parted in front of him like someone had drawn a blade through the crowd, leaving a clear path between the man who embodied the war's hierarchy and the woman who had flown back into its teeth. The Air Wing commander stepped forward with a half salute and half gesture toward a quieter side room, clearly intending to get the general out of public view before any interpretations were made. But the general shook his head once and said, voice rough but loud enough to carry, "No. Hey." Because whatever understanding he had reached in that canyon about what mattered and who needed to see it was stronger than his desire to sit down. His gaze swept the crowd until it landed on her, still dusty, hair flattened from the helmet, standing between two MPs who looked as unsure of their role as everyone else, and for a second something like confusion crossed his face, not because he didn't recognize her, but because he did, and the collision between past and present required a heartbeat to resolve. Then he started walking toward her, favoring one leg, the Special Operations Commander at his side murmuring that they should get him to a medic, and the entire hangar tracked his movement with the collective focus of people who sensed, even if they couldn't articulate it, that the story they would tell about this day was about to crystallize in the next few seconds. He stopped a few feet from her, breathing hard, and for a moment they just looked at each other, her still as a statue except for the rise and fall of her chest, him taking in the details of her uniform, the smudged lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and most of all the small gray wing patch with the silver pin above it that still sat exactly where it had years ago when a different crisis had unfolded under different skies, which meant that when he finally spoke, the words carried not only the weight of this mission but of a pattern he had seen before and never forgotten. "Who?" he asked, not because he didn't know but because formality mattered here. "Signed this pilot to transport duty." The question hung in the air, directed not at her but at the men behind her, and the mission commander shifted uncomfortably, mumbling something about allocations and manning and classification, because the logs that had made her look like an easy asset to mock now made his judgment look dangerously shallow. The general didn't wait for a full answer, because he had seen the cockpit footage while being hustled toward Medevac, had watched Hey Jet dance through fire on a tablet screen in the helicopter, and in that cramped cabin, with blood still drying in his hair, he had pointed at that same patch paused in a frame and said to a stunned operations aide, "That is not a transport mark." So now, in front of everyone, he stepped closer, reached up with one hand, and placed his fingers lightly on the patch, as if making sure it was real. Conversations that had begun to murmur back up in the rear of the hangar died again because the gesture felt intimate and formal at once, a kind of inspection and a kind of recognition, and the people who had laughed at that fabric hours earlier suddenly needed to know what they had missed. "Do you know what this is?" the general asked, turning his head slightly to address the room more than her, and no one rushed to answer, because the last time someone had guessed, they called it the Uber badge, and that line now tasted like ash. He let the silence stretch until it was taut, then said, with the practiced clarity of someone reading out unit honors, "This is the emblem of a black rescue wing that has flown missions you will never see reports of. These pilots go where we send no one else, into traps like the one you watched today, and they pull people like me out when our own arrogance has put us there." On the big screen behind him, a paused frame of Headjet skimming the canyon wall glowed, flares blooming in the background, and beside it an older, grainier image popped up at his gesture, a clip he'd ordered pulled from classified archives en route, showing a similar aircraft under different markings dropping through storm clouds toward a battered convoy years earlier, and the patch on that pilot's shoulder matched the one under his hand now, which meant anyone with eyes could see that this symbol had never been about ferrying luggage. The Air Wing commander, who had spent the last hour trying to balance doctrine against disaster, straightened and said, "Sir, we did issue a recall." But the general cut him off with a small, sharp motion and said, and she disobeyed, because she recognized what your pretty protocols would not, that if she turned away, you would lose your commander, this valley, and perhaps the war. Which forced everyone in the hangar to confront the simple causal chain from their earlier mockery to the brink. They had nearly toppled over. On the screen, her cockpit view replayed silently. The moment she killed her transponder, the jettison of tanks, the low dive into the canyon, each choice now narrated not as recklessness but as the logical progression of someone trained to treat human lives, not hardware, as the highest line on the balance sheet. And as the footage rolled, the other pilots in the room felt the same sick twist in their stomachs that comes when you realize your jokes have been aimed at the wrong target all day. The general dropped his hand from her patch and stepped back just enough to bring himself to attention despite the protest from his injured leg. Then, in front of the entire base, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute to her, not as a courtesy but as a public inversion of the hierarchy that had laughed at her earlier, which meant that in that moment, every lieutenant and major and colonel who had treated her as less valuable than their own reflections was forced to watch their world flip. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before returning the salute because years of conditioning did not simply vanish. But even as she lifted her hand, she understood that the room had changed orientation around her. The center of gravity had shifted from the loudest voices in the ready room to the quiet reality of what she had done in that canyon. I was pulled out of a different trap once, the general said, dropping his hand but keeping his eyes on her, by a pilot with this same patch who refused to leave when everyone told her to. I swore that if I ever saw that emblem again, I would not let anyone mistake it for anything less than what it is. He turned then to the Air Wing commander and said, voice steady, you will recommend this pilot for the highest valor your regulations allow, and you will review how you assign, brief, and listen to the people who wear this mark, because I will not have my life depend on someone you underestimate again. And the formal weight of that instruction pinned itself to every set of shoulders in the room like an invisible stone. The mission commander opened his mouth, perhaps to protest that he hadn't known, but the general's gaze sliced through him and froze the words on his tongue, which meant the public freeze had arrived not with shouting but with the sudden, deep quiet that falls when everyone understands that only one interpretation of events will be allowed to stand in the official record. The aftermath did not arrive as a cheer or a ceremony, but as a series of written orders and quiet adjustments that, together, changed the shape of life on the base, because the institution had to translate the moral snap it had just experienced into procedure. And that translation, while slower than emotion, cut deeper and lasted longer. Over the next days, the Air Wing commander signed off on a valor recommendation that described her mission in careful, measured language, noting how her actions had been in contravention of direct orders, but in alignment with the higher intent of theater preservation, which was the closest the system could come to admitting that sometimes its own rules lagged behind reality. And alongside that citation, he approved a reassignment that shifted her officially from transport slot to lead in a newly configured mixed-role rescue squadron, a unit that would quietly absorb the kind of work she had just done alone. The officers who had mocked her most loudly found themselves called into smaller rooms with blinds half-drawn, facing review boards that did not shout but did ask pointed questions about why documented threat reports had been dismissed, why a pilot's risk assessment had been waved away as nervousness, and why, precisely, it had seemed safe to use a colleague as the punchline of a joke when they knew nothing about her record. Some walked out with official reprimands and files that would stall their promotion tracks for years, others with reassignments to billets where their swagger would harm fewer people, and none of them bragged about the Uber badge anymore because the phrase had become shorthand for a kind of blindness they now understood could be career-ending. For her part, the woman at the center of it all did not mount a speech or claim a moral victory. She attended the required debriefs, answered questions in short, precise sentences, and when pressed about why she had disobeyed the recall order, she simply laid out the timeline in math, distance, fuel, convoy speed, pass closure, because those were the factors that had made her choice inevitable in her own mind, leaving the burden of interpretation to the people who had misinterpreted her for so long. The story of the canyon rescue spread through the base not in official briefings but in the small, reverent snippets people shared over coffee or in the weight room or in the line for the mess, each retelling smoothing some edges and sharpening others, but always preserving the same core. She had gone back when everyone else turned away, and the man they all feared losing now walked the halls because she had treated the patch on her shoulder as an obligation, not an ornament. The ready room where the first jokes had been made felt different now. Pilots were a little more careful with their laughter, a little quicker to look twice at a symbol they didn't recognize, because no one wanted to be the next one caught on a recording mocking someone who turned out to be the only reason their commander or friend or they themselves were still breathing, and that social recalibration mattered as much as any written policy, because it shifted what the group considered acceptable cruelty and lazy thinking. A week after the mission, As the sun slid low over the desert and painted the flight line in long gold streaks, a small group gathered near her new aircraft, a jet that still bore some of the old scuffs of the previous week's work along with freshly tuned systems and a cleaned-up skin. And there were no cameras, no speeches scheduled, just a few pilots comparing notes before sorties and ground crew finishing checklists. When a dark sedan rolled to a stop a little distance away, the general stepped out without an entourage this time, wearing a neatly pressed uniform with his arm in a less bulky sling and his gait still careful but stronger. And when people noticed him, conversations dimmed out of habit, but he lifted a hand in a casual wave that told them he had not come for another all-hands address. He walked across the tarmac toward her, his shoes clicking softly against concrete, and she paused where she stood near her jet's ladder, helmet under one arm, waiting without moving to meet him halfway. Because whatever this was, it was between the two of them before it was for anyone else. He stopped within arm's reach, looked at her for a moment with an expression that held more tired gratitude than ceremony, then reached out and once more adjusted the gray wing patch on her shoulder, smoothing it where a stitch had started to fray, and said, in a voice pitched for her but audible to the nearby cluster, "Never let them call this transport again." It was not a grand pronouncement, not a line polished for history, but it carried enough intent that the few who heard it would repeat it almost word for word in the weeks to come until it became part of the base's private lexicon. He stepped back then, came slowly to attention despite his healing body, and gave her a smaller, more personal salute than the one in the hangar, one that did not invert the entire room's hierarchy but acknowledged, in a quiet exchange of gazes, that they both knew what she had risked and what he owed. She returned the salute with the same steady precision she had shown in the canyon, lowered her hand, and they let the silence between them stand in for all the speeches neither of them intended to make. Around them, a few ground crew who had once laughed at the taxi jokes shifted their weight, looked at her patch with new eyes, and one of them, the crew chief who had joked about luggage on the line, brushed his fingers lightly against the emblem as he walked past to check a wheel chock, not saying anything but carrying a new, almost protective awareness that this small piece of fabric had come to symbolize something far heavier than a transport assignment. The general turned and walked back to his car without fanfare, the Air Wing commander watching from a distance with his hands in his pockets, and the vehicles drove away toward the headquarters building where paperwork still waited to be signed and meetings still waited to be held, because the machine of the institution never fully stopped, even when it had been briefly shocked into seeing itself. She climbed the ladder into her jet again, settling into the cockpit as the last light caught the lines of the aircraft and the patch on her shoulder glowed faintly in the reflection on the canopy, and as the engine spooled up and the flight line crew moved into position, there was no cheering, no chance of her call sign, just a subtle straightening of backs and a small widening of the space around her as if people, consciously or not, were making room for someone they would never again mistake. For the bus driver at the back of the mission. When the jet rolled forward and lifted into the darkening sky, the only sounds were the rising whine of turbines and the rustle of paperwork in the control tower, and yet the flight line felt different than it had on that first morning, because everyone who watched her climb now did so with a quiet respect that would not show up in any citation but would linger in the way they looked at that patch, at her, and at themselves. Every time the clock on the mission board began to count down.